Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to Investing Sucks. So today I'm going to do a video about quantitative easing, or QE, and specifically why QE in and of itself is not actually the same thing as printing money. And I think this is an important topic to make a video on just because of the drastic increase in M2 money supply we've seen over the last 2 years, both here in Canada and in the United States as well. And as a result of that, there's this prevailing narrative that this rise in the money supply, this very rapid rise in the money supply, is due to the QE that the central banks are doing. And it's also causing inflation, essentially because you have a larger amount of money chasing the same amount of goods as there was, say, not too long ago, because economic growth has been rather stagnant the past 2 years because of that thing that happened in 2020. And that could cause the prices of those goods to rise. Although there are certainly other things that are contributing to inflation, and inflation is a very complex topic that has a lot of variables and moving parts. The prevailing belief is that QE is in at least part to blame. There are, of course, other topics such as something that's going on in the world right now, which is impacting energy and food prices, but that's outside the scope of this video. So what I want to do in this video is cover number one, the process of QE, explain how it works at a technical level, and also explain why QE in and of itself doesn't cause inflation, and it's not necessarily going to be the same thing as printing money, although under certain circumstances, it can actually give certain results of that. And I'm going to give real world examples of this as well. Okay, so let's first start with why central banks decide to do QE in the first place. So when central banks decide to do QE, typically it's because there's some issue in the economy, and their goal is to increase lending and credit growth in the economy, because that can help stimulate economic growth and make an economic downturn not nearly as bad. And this flow chart that I have in Excel here kind of explains how this whole process works. So if there is some sort of economic downturn, say there's a market crash or something happens like the 2008 financial crisis, this helps ease the pain. And if they don't do this, then something seriously bad could happen, like the Great Depression. One of the reasons why the Great Depression ended up being as bad as it was because of the monetary policy decisions made by the United States at the time. They actually implemented rather contractionary monetary policy, which made things much worse during the Great Depression, which, looking back on it, obviously we know that it's a mistake now, but at the time there was really no precedent for the United States to go off of, no monetary policy that they could follow. But now we do have a monetary policy template where if something happens like a financial crisis or like the lockdowns that occurred in early 2020, central banks now know what to do, and it usually involves QE and lowering interest rates. So once the decision to implement QE has been made, the central bank then buys assets on the open market. So the assets they buy are more often than not going to be government bonds. They can also include corporate bonds, mortgage bonds, and even in some cases, stocks. But the vast majority of the time, it's going to be government bonds. Now, it's important to note that they don't buy these government bonds directly from the government when the government issues them. When the government of Canada or the US government issues these bonds, they actually will hold an auction where certain primary dealers, as they're called, which are really just large financial institutions, so big banks basically, they will bid on those bonds and then they get sold to the highest bidder. So it works like a traditional auction. Now, the central bank cannot enter those auctions. So when they buy government bonds, they're only buying the government bonds from the open market, not directly from the government, which, if that were the case, then yes, you can make the case that that is money printing, because the government's issuing bonds, the central bank, which has the power to create money, can just buy those bonds directly. So you're just giving the money to the government for free, but it actually has to go through the financial institutions. So, and for my Canadian viewers out there, I'll put a list of the financial institutions that have the ability and have the authority to bid in these government auctions. I'll put it on screen here in case anyone is interested in knowing that. So essentially, they're not buying bonds directly from the government. That's the key point. They're buying them from financial institutions after they've already been issued. So we can actually update this chart here. We can put the government there. So the government will issue bonds to the financial institutions. So bonds will go that way. And in exchange, what the financial institutions will get is what's called a settlement balance. So I'll just abbreviate that as SB there. So that's the way that the central banks will actually pay for these bond purchases with a settlement balance. And a settlement balance is not technically money because for something to be money, if anyone who's taken an economics course, it has to be three things: a medium of exchange, a unit of account, and a storehold of value. And a settlement balance is not technically a medium of exchange. It's really just a special type of money that can only be used by financial institutions and the central bank. So just those parties alone. For example, just regular individuals or businesses really can't use settlement balances. So as a result of this whole process, the banks now have more cash in their accounts because they have sold these bonds that they were previously holding to the central bank, who then bought them on the open market from them. And what they can do with this money is they can lend it out to businesses, individuals for mortgages, nonprofit organizations, whoever wants it, really, and they can use it for whatever purpose they want. Now that's when that lending occurs, that's when QE actually becomes money printing. It requires this newly created money to actually be lent out. And in order for that to happen, you need to have businesses that actually want to lend money. They actually want debt. And if there's none of that, then really no money printing can take place. So in summary, QE can cause inflation due to the ripple effects that has on the economic system. But just because QE is happening does not mean inflation will happen. Now, you'll often hear the phrase, the central banks are monetizing government debt. Now, this can be a little confusing because when you hear that, it sounds like the central bank is just outright buying bonds issued by the government and giving them money, which they can go spend it on whatever they want. And that's going to cause inflation, which that probably would cause inflation because it's quite literally just money being created. But as we've already established, in order for it to actually be money printing, once the central banks buy the government bonds and from the financial institutions have to use that money and lend it out to whoever wants it: businesses, individuals, nonprofits, whatever. So what that really refers to, the monetizing of government debt, is when QE lowers interest rates, because it does have that effect. Because if you think about it, if the central bank is buying bonds, that's an increase in the demand for bonds, which increases the prices of the bonds, which lowers the yield on the bonds, and a lower yield on bonds means lower interest rates. So that's something important to note about QE. That's how it lowers interest rates, really, because with the central bank buying all these government bonds, that increases the demand, which eventually has the effect of decreasing interest rates. So the monetizing of government spending happens because QE really puts a cap on long-term interest rates, which lowers the government's borrowing costs, which allows them to borrow more money and thus spend more money. And therefore, spending increases and the overall demand in the economy increases, which, if the economy isn't also producing more goods and services to match that rise in demand, then yes, that can cause inflation. But again, I want to establish this up front. Inflation is a very complex topic. You're never going to be able to just point to one thing and say, this is what's responsible for inflation, this is what's causing inflation. It's always going to be a blend of many things. And there's so many things that go into inflation that it can actually be skewed if we're referring to the CPI, which I know not everyone agrees that the CPI actually is inflation. There's so many things that go into it that a drastic price increase in one thing that is making up a larger portion of the CPI can cause more inflation. Okay, so now I'm going to give a real life example of when quantitative easing does not cause inflation. And this is a live example. This is something that's currently happening right now. And anyone who's well versed in macroeconomics today probably already knows what country I'm going to mention, and that is Japan. So on the screen here, I have the Nikkei index, and this is going back about 25 years. So as you can see, in about the late 1980s, so 1989, this index had a pretty massive speculative bull run. It went up a significant amount, and then it came crashing down quite a lot. And even to this day, it hasn't actually fully recovered to the level it was once at, which I know for a lot of index fund investors out there, that's a bit of a scarying thought, because 25 years later in the future, I mean, that can be pretty much someone's entire working life. And if you're investing in an index with the hope that it will just continue to go up, so you don't have to worry about, picking individual stocks in order to save for retirement, then it's a bit of a worrying thought there. But that's besides the point. And so this speculative boom was driven in part by, number one, how fast the Japanese economy was growing up to that point, and also the common belief that it would continue on that trajectory and eventually become one of the world's leading economic superpowers. And so if we look at the Japanese total GDP here, we can see very massive growth in the mid 1980s up until about the late 1990s. But since then, it hasn't really grown that much. And actually, if you look at where it was back then to where it was today, it's actually gone down. So it hasn't been able to grow its GDP pretty much at all in the last 25 years. Now, if we look at what's happened with Japan's money supply during this time period, we can see it's continued to go up. So we can see in the year 2000, and then pretty much in the years following, it just continued to go up and up and up. And then after 2020, it had a much drastic increase there. So the conventional wisdom in relation to inflation specifically would be, well, if the money supply is increasing, but the economy is actually stagnant, then there has to be inflation, right? Because you have an increasing amount of money chasing a stagnant amount of goods. So naturally, the price of those goods is going to have to rise because there's more money chasing it. But if we look here at the actual Japanese inflation rate, and look at what it's done throughout this time period, we can actually see more often than not, it's been a negative inflation rate. So we can see negative for this period here. It was positive here, but only 1.6. That's in 1997. And then 5 years of negative, so deflation. And then in the last decade and a half, it's kind of been a mix between positive inflation and deflation. And the highest it's been really in the last 25 years was this year here in 2014, when it was only 2.5%. And even in these years here, so 2020 and 2019, they had deflation as well. Now, deflation, as many people know, is generally not seen as a good thing for an economy, because you want to have a little bit of inflation because it encourages spending, which encourages economic growth. And if you have deflation, then there's a risk that people are going to hold back on purchases because they think that they're going to decrease in price into the future, which can hurt economic growth and even lead to further deflation just because of the lack of demand in the economy. So going back to our illustration here, you can probably now understand why the ability to create money, which the central bank has, and the ability to spend money, which the government has, is kept separate. Because if it wasn't, then the central bank could just always be doing QE and give money directly to the government, and that could have some dire consequences and probably cause hyperinflation. So now, because inflation is running much higher than the 2% target we have here in Canada, and because the economy overall is doing well, employment rates are good, they're stopping to do the QE and starting to raise interest rates to cool down the inflation. So that's my explanation of how this whole process works. Hopefully you did find it useful. And as always, feel free to ask any questions in the comment section, or maybe correct me if you think I got something wrong, or if I missed an important point. I always enjoy hearing from you guys and learning from you guys as well. And subscribe if you're new to my channel and you enjoy this type of content. And with that in mind, I'll see you guys in the next video.